The Holloway estate sits where the mist never truly lifts, its windows clouded with the kind of sorrow that clings to the bones of old wood. When the sun falls behind the Kentucky hills, the house becomes something else entirely, a breathing, watching thing that remembers what was done within its walls. It was here that Clara Holloway returned after her mother's burial, stepping across the threshold of a place that once felt like home but now pulsed with quiet dread. Her father greeted her with a smile that did not belong to the man she remembered. The years of solitude had carved something unholy into him. His eyes no longer met hers with paternal warmth, but with a haunted recognition, as though he were seeing a ghost wearing his wife's face. In the dim parlor light, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, murmuring her mother's name instead of her own. At night, Clara heard his voice through the floorboards, whispering to the empty rocking chair in her mother's sewing room. Sometimes, he laughed softly, other times, he wept. The servants had long since left, claiming they saw Margaret's shadow wandering the hall, calling for Clara to come home. But what unsettled her most was not the ghostly echoes, nor the silence that followed. It was the moment she looked into her father's eyes and realized he no longer saw the difference between the living and the dead. When he spoke of love, it was not of the kind meant for fathers and daughters. And as the storm clouds gathered over the willows, Clara began to understand that the grave her mother occupied might not be the only one the Holloways would fill before spring. The morning Margaret Holloway died began like any other in the misty hills of eastern Kentucky, except for the stillness that followed. The willows, the Holloway family estate, sat wrapped in fog so thick it muffled the sound of church bells from the valley below. Inside, the scent of lilacs clung to the air, the last trace of a woman who had been the town's quiet mystery. Margaret had always moved through life with an otherworldly calm, her pale face and soft voice making her seem more ghost than flesh even while she lived. But that morning, something in the air shifted. The servants found her nightgown folded neatly by the bed, her wedding ring placed atop it like an offering. Her body was discovered by the pond behind the orchard, drifting under the willows where she used to hum lullabies to her daughter, Clara. The official word spread quickly. For Clara, still away at boarding school, the news came in the form of a letter that arrived 2 days too late. Her mother's handwriting covered one side of the page, words shaky, unfinished, as if she had been interrupted mid-sentence. On the back, in her father's steady hand, was a single line, * your mother has gone to rest. Come home, my dear. * when she stepped off the train weeks later, she saw the willows swaying by the pond, their branches bent low over the water as if mourning or hiding something beneath. Clara Holloway returned to the willows beneath a bruised sky, her train cutting through the hills like a blade through fog. It had been nearly 4 years since she'd last seen her childhood home, a place she remembered in fragments, the smell of lilac soap, the sound of the piano drifting from her mother's hands, the soft creak of the stairs late at night. But as the carriage rolled up the dirt path, she felt something cold press against her chest. The once vibrant gardens were now choked by weeds, and the windows stared blankly, reflecting only the grey of the overcast sky. The Holloway estate, once alive with the hum of laughter and dinner parties, had the silence of a tomb. Her father greeted her at the front steps, dressed in black despite the absence of mourning ribbons. He looked older, yes, but there was a strange vitality in his face, a feverish brightness in his eyes that made her uneasy. He smiled, wide, too long, as though the gesture were new to him. His voice trembled not with grief, but with something else, something that sounded dangerously close to joy. You've come home at last, he whispered, his hand lingering on her shoulder a moment too long. Inside, everything felt wrong. The portraits were draped in cloth, the furniture rearranged as if the house itself had forgotten how to be lived in. The scent of lilacs still clung to the halls, faint and haunting, though Margaret's perfume bottle on the vanity was empty. Clara's old room had been untouched, preserved with eerie precision, even the half-burnt candle on her bedside table left unlit. It was as though her absence had been rehearsed, her return expected. At night, the house came alive in ways she didn't remember. The floorboards groaned like voices whispering beneath her feet. Her mother's sewing room, once her favorite place to hide, was locked tight, though she could swear she heard movement within. Once, passing the parlor, she saw her father sitting in the dark, speaking softly to the empty chair that had belonged to Margaret. When he noticed her, his eyes flickered with confusion before he smiled again, too warmly, too intimately. The servants avoided her questions, their faces pale, their answers trembling. "He talks to her," one finally muttered before hastily crossing herself. That night, Clara lay awake listening to the faint hum of her father's voice through the floorboards, low and rhythmic, calling someone's name over and over. It wasn't hers. It was her mother's. Elias Holloway had always been a man of strict habits and quiet dignity, but after Margaret's death, the rhythm of his days began to twist into something unnatural. Clara noticed it first in the way he moved through the house, slowly, deliberately, as if following invisible footsteps left behind by someone else. He no longer shaved, no longer spoke to the neighbors, and no longer opened the curtains in the morning. Instead, he sat for hours in the parlor, his gaze fixed on the portrait of his late wife, lips moving in a soft murmur too low for Clara to catch. His obsession with her memory grew heavier each day, spreading through the halls like the damp air that clung to the wallpaper. At first, Clara thought it was grief. She tried to comfort him, sitting beside him as the wind howled through the broken shutters, reading aloud from her mother's favorite psalms. But Elias's eyes never left Clara's face when she spoke, and she began to feel the weight of his stare, like a man seeing something he shouldn't. He called her Margaret more than once, each time brushing it off with a trembling laugh, though his expression betrayed no amusement. When she corrected him, he'd touch her hair and whisper, "You sound just like her." The changes deepened with time. Elias began to wear his late wife's perfume, the faint scent following him from room to room. He moved his study into her sewing room, claiming it brought him peace, but Clara could hear him talking to someone late into the night, his voice low, affectionate, punctuated by long silences as if he were listening to an answer. One evening, she caught him standing before the mirror in that locked room, holding her mother's wedding veil, his reflection smiling faintly even after he turned away. The sight rooted her to the doorway, a chill crawling up her spine as she realized he hadn't noticed her watching. In the daylight, he could still pretend to be the man she once knew. He spoke gently, asked after her health, complimented the color of her dress. But the tenderness was wrong, misplaced, heavy with something that did not belong between father and daughter. There were moments when his voice dropped to a whisper, his hand hovering too close to her cheek as if he were afraid to touch what he desired but could not name. Clara began to understand that her father's grief had turned into something else, something dark and consuming, as though in losing Margaret, he had decided to resurrect her through the only person left who bore her face. Clara discovered the mirror room by accident on a day when the rain refused to stop. The sound of it against the windows made the house feel smaller, the air heavy and restless. She had spent hours wandering through the halls, tracing her fingers along the wallpaper that peeled like aging skin, until she found herself before a door she had never noticed before. It was tucked behind the grand staircase, hidden by a tapestry depicting an angel with its eyes torn away. The handle was cold to the touch, and though the door was locked, a single key hung from a nail beside it, as if waiting for her. When she stepped inside, the air felt different, thicker, colder, carrying the faint smell of lavender and dust. The room was lined entirely with mirrors, each of a different shape and size, their glass warped and speckled with time. Some leaned against the wall, others hung crooked, reflecting her from angles that felt unnatural. In the center stood a chair draped in her mother's shawl, and beside it, a table covered in journals, photographs, and the remnants of burned candles. It was as if Margaret had been here moments before, her presence lingering in every reflection. Clara opened one of the journals, its pages covered in her mother's delicate handwriting. The words were calm at first, entries about household chores, garden notes, and Clara's schooling, but as the pages turned, the tone shifted. Margaret wrote of dreams where her reflections spoke to her, where she saw another version of herself standing in the glass, whispering secrets about Elias and his bloodline. She described feeling watched, even when alone, and hinted at a sickness that ran through the Holloway men. The final pages were smeared, the ink blurred by tears or perhaps something darker. As Clara stood before one of the larger mirrors, she caught her mother's face instead of her own. For a heartbeat, she froze, the resemblance so strong it felt like the glass was remembering her. But when she blinked, the reflection shifted back to her, though her heart continued to pound as if something unseen had just stepped closer. The candlelight flickered violently, and she thought she heard a whisper, her name, carried on a breath that wasn't her own. That night, she asked her father about the room, But his expression hardened instantly. He told her never to go there again, that it was where her mother prayed for forgiveness. The way he said it, his voice cracking, told Clara he wasn't afraid of her disobedience. He was afraid of what she might have already seen. It was on a humid Sunday evening when Elias Holloway gathered what few townsfolk still tolerated his presence and invited them into the Willows for what he called a sermon. The invitation came handwritten on brittle paper, signed in his precise, old-fashioned script, claiming he had received enlightenment through sorrow. Curiosity and pity lured a handful of neighbors to the estate, though most came only to whisper about the Holloways' growing madness. The parlor was lit with flickering oil lamps that threw long shadows across the faded wallpaper, and the smell of bourbon lingered heavily in the air. Elias stood before them, his collar loosened, his face flushed, his eyes wide with an unsteady kind of conviction. He began speaking of loss and divine purpose, his voice trembling yet deliberate. At first, it sounded like grief, a broken man seeking meaning after tragedy, but soon his words shifted into something more fevered. He spoke of the sacred circle of blood, of purity untouched by the corruption of outsiders, and of how the soul must reunite with its origin to restore God's first design. His guests exchanged glances, uncertain whether to pity him or flee. Some said later that his voice changed, that it grew deeper, almost unrecognizable, as if another presence spoke through him. Elias pointed to Clara, who stood in the doorway watching, her hands trembling against the wood. He called her a vessel of divine inheritance, the only true continuation of Margaret's spirit. He declared that through her, heaven's order could be restored, and that love beyond the flesh was a calling, not a sin. The air in the room seemed to tighten, as though the walls themselves recoiled from his words. Clara wanted to scream, to run, but something in her father's gaze held her still. His eyes glowed with a manic tenderness, and she saw in them both devotion and doom. When the sermon ended, silence hung like a curse. No one clapped, no one prayed. The guests left quietly, their footsteps quick on the gravel path, their whispers carried into the dark. By morning, the story had spread through town how Elias Holloway had gone mad, how he spoke of sacred unions and pure bloodlines, how he looked at his daughter not as a child, but as an answer to some unholy prophecy. The preacher refused to visit the estate again, and the local children began crossing themselves whenever they passed its gate. Inside the Willows, the mirrors had been covered, the candles burned down to stubs, and from the upper rooms, neighbors swore they could hear the sound of a man laughing and weeping all at once. The proposal came on a night when thunder rolled across the hills and the rain lashed against the windows with a fury that felt almost deliberate. The Willows was soaked in shadows, the power long gone, and the only light came from the candelabra Elias had placed on the dinner table. He had ordered Clara to dress in one of her mother's old gowns, a white lace dress that still carried the faint scent of lavender and thyme. She obeyed in silence, the weight of his gaze pressing on her as she descended the stairs. The room seemed to breathe around them, the fire sputtering as if unwilling to bear witness to what was about to unfold. Elias stood at the head of the table, a glass of wine trembling slightly in his hand. He looked both regal and unhinged, his hair unkempt, his shirt collar open, his smile stretched too wide. "You remind me of her," he said softly, almost reverently. "Not just in face or voice, but in spirit. When you speak, I hear her. When you walk, I see her." Clara tried to look away, but he stepped closer, his hand brushing the side of her face. "She was never meant to leave," he whispered. "But perhaps, she never truly did." He began to speak of divine plans again, of cycles that must complete themselves, of blood that called to blood. He claimed that Margaret had appeared to him in dreams, telling him that love could not die, only change form. His words were tender and horrifying at once. He knelt before Clara, the candlelight glinting in his eyes like fever, and took her trembling hands in his. "You complete the circle," he said. "You are the continuation of what was begun. Through you, she lives again." From his pocket, he produced a ring, her mother's wedding ring, still dulled from years of wear. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to pull away, but her voice failed her. Elias slid the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, his lips brushing her knuckles in a gesture that made her skin crawl. He spoke vows without prompting, words that were once holy but now curdled into something profane. The storm outside roared, lightning flashing against the mirrors in the hallway, casting their reflections in fractured light. When it was over, he stood, smiling through tears. "Now we are whole again," he murmured. "Margaret is home." Clara could not tell whether he was speaking to her or to the ghost that lingered in the space between them. The ceremony was small, secret, and held in the dim, suffocating heart of the willows, where the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and forgotten prayers. The preacher, a man with debts and vices, had agreed to officiate quietly in exchange for a handful of coins, his hands shaking as he held the Bible and avoided looking at Elias or Clara. The windows were shuttered, the candelabras flickering against the walls, casting long, grotesque shadows that danced as if in mockery of the vows being spoken. Outside, the storm had not relented, rain pounded the roof in relentless rhythm, thunder rolling through the hills like the anger of a god observing a blasphemy. Elias stood at the altar, or what passed for one in the parlor, dressed in his mother's funeral suit, oddly stiff, his face pale beneath the glow of the candles. Clara, in the white lace gown she had worn for the proposal, looked smaller than she had in the mirror room, the hem of her dress catching on the splintered floorboards. The preacher's voice trembled as he began, his words formal but hollow, his eyes darting between them like a man afraid to see what he was blessing. He asked for consent, and Elias's voice rang clear and unwavering, but Clara's lips barely moved, the word "I" stuck in her throat as though the house itself were holding it back. The vows were whispered more than spoken, the room absorbing them into its dark corners. Elias promised to cherish, protect, and honor Clara in ways that seemed to twist the meaning of each word, his eyes never leaving hers, burning with a devotion that made the air tremble. When Clara repeated her lines, her voice was brittle, carrying the weight of fear and confusion, but the preacher nodded, eager to finish. There was a hush after the last words, the silence so absolute it pressed into Clara's ears, and in that moment, the storm seemed to answer, lightning illuminating the mirrors down the hall, reflecting not one but two figures, herself and her mother, or some impossible amalgamation of them both. The exchange of rings was mechanical, almost ritualistic. Elias slid the ring onto her finger, the metal cold against her skin, and when their hands touched, the candlelight flickered violently, shadows rippling like living things along the walls. The preacher muttered a final blessing, his words lost to the rumble of thunder. Outside, the wind shrieked as if in protest, and a branch struck the window with a loud crack, shaking the glass in its frame. In the quiet that followed, Clara felt the weight of the house pressing down upon her, the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same. She glanced at Elias, who smiled with a strange, feverish triumph, and for the first time, she understood that the vows were not just a promise, they were a binding of shadows, a union that carried a darkness far older and more consuming than either of them could ever escape. The town's outrage was swift and unforgiving, spreading like wildfire through the narrow streets and dusty fields of the valley. When the news reached the general store, the blacksmith's forge, and the small chapel, neighbors whispered in disbelief, their voices trembling with a mixture of fear and moral horror. They spoke of the Holloways in hushed tones, their words painting the father-daughter union as a blasphemy that tainted the soil itself. Children were told to cross themselves when passing the estate, women shook their heads and muttered prayers, and even the men who had once been indifferent now carried pitchforks in thought, imagining the confrontation that might be needed. A few of the braver, or perhaps more reckless residents made their way up the muddy path to the willows, shouting from the gates, demanding that Elias release his daughter from what they called a curse. Their voices bounced against the stone walls, carried into the house like stones thrown at a beast. But no one answered. The heavy doors stayed shut, bolted from the inside, and the shutters rattled in protest against the wind, giving the illusion that the house itself was alive, defiant, guarding its secrets with a patience born of madness. Inside, Elias moved with a deliberate calm, pacing the halls like a conductor orchestrating a symphony that only he could hear. Clara followed silently, each step echoing in the cavernous rooms, the walls lined with mirrors that now seemed to multiply the sense of unease. Through the panes, she could see the storm outside mirrored in fragments, a chaos that matched the turmoil in her chest. Her father spoke softly, his voice a mixture of triumph and feverish devotion. He explained that the world outside could not understand them, could not comprehend the perfection of what had been done. He told Clara that the whispers of outrage were merely noise, nothing more than the cries of those too weak to recognize destiny. Days passed, and the townspeople's protests became more intense. Threats were left pinned to the gates, the preacher who had married them was publicly shamed, and a few daring men tried to scale the estate walls under the cover of night, only to find the mirrors reflecting more than just themselves, shapes moving where no one should have been, shadows that seemed to anticipate each motion, guiding their retreat in terror. The Holloways remained inside, locked away in a house that had become a fortress of obsession. The storm outside persisted, or perhaps it never truly ended, howling over the hills, carrying with it the collective fury and dread of a town that had glimpsed something far darker than they could ever confront, something that could not be undone. Within those walls, Clara began to realize that the world outside could rage and threaten as it pleased, but the true horror was not in the anger of the townspeople. It was in the quiet, deliberate certainty of her father, in the way the house itself seemed to bend around them, and in the knowledge that she had become part of something far larger and far darker than she had ever imagined. The second death came quietly, almost imperceptibly, as though the house itself had been waiting for it. Clara had begun to feel the walls of the willows pressing closer, the air thick with the residue of obsession and grief, when she noticed something different about her father's routine. The parlor, once filled with his fevered mutterings and restless pacing, was silent. At first, she thought he had taken to wandering the grounds in the rain, or perhaps sleeping in one of the unused rooms, but by the third hour, unease had settled into a concrete weight on her chest. She moved through the dim corridors, the flicker of candlelight casting grotesque shadows across the walls, until she reached the bedroom they shared in uneasy proximity. The door was ajar, and inside, Elias lay motionless on the floor, his body unnaturally still. The scent of bourbon and lilacs lingered, mingling in a way that made her stomach churn. On the bedside table, she found a folded letter in his handwriting, the edges damp from condensation or tears she could not tell. The words were precise, almost clinical, yet carried a weight that made her fingers tremble as she read them. *, you were never born but remade. The circle completes with you, and I am released. Forgive me. *, there was no hint of struggle, no sign of violence, just the quiet, final certainty that he had chosen to end his life rather than face the world outside, the judgment of the town, or the consequence of his own obsession. Clara sank to her knees beside him, the room spinning with disbelief. She could hear the storm outside still raging, the wind tearing at the shutters, but inside, everything was unnaturally still, as though time itself had paused to mark this moment. Her father's expression, frozen in death, was almost serene, and yet beneath that serenity lay the madness that had grown so strong in the months since her mother's passing. She traced the lines of his face, the hands that had held hers too tightly, the lips that had whispered her mother's name in moments meant only for her, and felt a bitter knot of grief and revulsion twist in her chest. When she rose, the mirrors lining the hallways seemed different, reflecting not only her image but the weight of the house, the echo of Elias's obsession, and the lingering presence of Margaret that had never truly left. Clara realized that the death of her father did not free her, it merely changed the terms of her confinement. The walls of the willows still pulsed with the memory of what had transpired within, and she understood that the story of her father's final act, his surrender to madness, to love, to the impossible, would haunt her long after the echoes of his voice had faded. The house itself seemed to mourn and to mock in equal measure, a reminder that some bonds, once formed, are never truly broken, and that the shadow of obsession can outlive even death itself. Clara did not sleep that night. The house seemed to pulse with a rhythm of its own, each creak of the floorboards and sigh of the wind carrying echoes of the past. She wandered through the halls, the candlelight trembling in her hand, drawn again and again to the mirror room. The door, long forbidden, now stood slightly ajar, as though inviting her in. Her hands shook as she pushed it open, and the room greeted her with the familiar cold air and faint scent of lavender, thickened now with the weight of something unseen. She stepped inside, her reflection fractured across dozens of mirrors, each one reflecting not only her image but the flickering shadows that seemed to move independently of her own. As she approached the largest mirror, the one that had always seemed to hold the most power, her breath caught in her throat. At first, it was only her reflection, pale and wide-eyed, trembling with the candlelight. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, another figure began to emerge behind her, a woman, tall and still, dressed in the white lace that had once been Margaret's wedding gown. Her face was unmistakable, though hollowed with a spectral pallor, and her eyes bore into Clara's with a knowledge that seemed older than memory itself. The reflection did not blink, did not move, yet it radiated awareness, a presence that was both comforting and terrifying. Clara's heartbeat thundered in her ears. She could feel the walls of the room closing in, the mirrors bending the light, the shadows pooling in corners where there should have been nothing. She wanted to speak, to ask if it was truly her mother or some trick of the glass, but her voice failed. The figure raised a hand slowly, deliberately, and Clara felt the weight of unseen fingers brush her shoulder. The candle sputtered, casting a jagged shadow across the room, and in that moment, the line between past and present, life and death, seemed to dissolve. The journals she had found months before lay open on the table, their pages fluttering in a breeze she could not feel. She remembered Margaret's words, the dreams of reflections speaking, the warnings of bloodlines and cycles. The mirror now confirmed what her mother had written, though Clara could not discern whether it was a revelation or a curse. She realized with a cold, sinking certainty that Margaret had never truly left the Willows, that in some way, in some dark, twisted geometry of obsession and grief, her presence had remained, watching, guiding, perhaps even shaping the events that had bound father and daughter together in the first place. Clara stepped back, her reflection and Margaret's lingering in the glass as if frozen in time, and she understood that nothing at the Willows would ever be simple again. The house, the mirrors, the echoes of love and madness, they were all alive, and she was trapped within their gaze. Every whisper, every shadow, every flicker of light spoke of a past that had not ended, a cycle that had not been broken, and a darkness that would follow her long after the candle had burned out.